Hi, this is Bay McFarland with Mary's Advocates, and we work to reduce unilateral no-fault divorce. I have with me Matthew Johnson, who's speaking about a case that his mom is doing right now in appellate court. Matthew, where's that case?
The case is now in Albany, New York.
And what's happened with the appeals? You had told me that the divorce was issued in, when did they make the divorce decree?
The divorce decree was filed in January of 2017 of this year.
Okay, and then you guys did an appeal and you filed your appellate brief a couple months later.
Yeah, my mother just filed, within the past, month or two. Her latest brief has just been put in. Yeah.
And some of the elements that you're talking about is that unilateral no-fault divorce in and of itself as a statute enacted by the legislature is unconstitutional?
It's unconstitutional, and it basically destroys marriage altogether, the institution of marriage altogether, because there are essentially no rights and liabilities that can be attached to marriage, and nobody can be held accountable for leaving and exiting a marriage for even misconduct that they've committed. So there's really no difference between marriage and just casual living.
Or worse, because then they have powers to take your money. What are some of the principles that you threw out some things there about it's not constitutional? Why not?
It's not constitutional because oftentimes, and I think across the board, there's something what's called an irretrievable breakdown statement, where one party has to basically say that the marriage is broken down and you can't retrieve it. And this is really just a very vague phrase, a vague definition that can't be found to be true through any evidence, and there's no standard.
Or nobody even knows what it means. I'm angry at I'm angry at my sister, so I say I hate you and you're evil, and they're like, what? What's that mean? How can you be punished because your little sister says you're evil? What does that mean?
Right, and I mean, basically, nobody knows. I mean, for example, my mother. I mean, she doesn't know what caused the marriage to be irretrievable, and she didn't know how to avoid it, and she doesn't know why she's being accused of no fault. I mean, the judge said basically that the divorce is against her, so if it's against her, she should at least know why.
Okay, so that's one of the reasons. Do you have anything in your mom's briefs about contract rights or rights of marriage and marriage itself?
My mother has put in discussion about marital rights. Basically, there are laws in New York, but in other states as well. In New York, there are laws about having an established domicile. If you're a married person, you have a right to an established domicile. You also have a right as a woman or as a less moneyed spouse to not be held liable for the control and debts of the other person if they've made that unilaterally.
Debts. So
oftentimes they'll say whatever debts and whatever assets you've incurred in the marriage, are both of yours and should be split, in half. But say, for instance, one spouse decides, well, I'm going to incur all of this debt, maybe even right before my.
No, I've heard about that. I know of a woman right now.
In my dad's case, he incurred lots and lots of debt right before the divorce, and basically my mom has now had to assume all of that. Basically, what the marital rights under New York says is basically that she shouldn't be held liable to that. But what NoFault does is basically say, well, we don't need to consider any of these rights because basically they show fault. And NoFault, the whole purpose of NoFault is to not show fault. So, this is the example in New York, but the same can be said anywhere where there are certain rights attached to marriage that you, as a married person, should have. And if those have been breached, those should be considered during the divorce.
Well, and there's the other part of marriage. Marriage was around as an institution that people understood long before our states even came into existence. I mean, people knew that marriage meant you're going to work together to support a household. Marriage meant you were going to work together to raise children. Marriage meant that you're going to be sexually faithful. People knew that. They know that now. Yeah. I mean, it's ingrained in our nature. Marriage is ingrained in natural law. So for a state to come in and turn marriage upside down, you had told me something like in essence, what you're asking the appellate court to do is something that the legislators didn't have courage to do. What was that?
Basically, the way that my mother's brief phrased it was to say that the legislature doesn't have the courage to say that they basically abolished marriage through their no-fault statute, because that's in its effect essentially what it has done. So even though they might say, well, how does it abolish marriage? The way that it plays out in trial or in a case, a proceeding, the way that it plays out is that basically no fault trumps every other type of law that could give you protection. So,
all right.
There's no.
And so, what appellate court is this in right now?
This is the Third Department Appellate Court in Albany, New York.
Okay, so right now, the judges in Albany, New York, are being asked whether or not the New York legislature abolished marriage based on constitutional principles. All right, thank you.
Exactly.
We might visit back with you as more progresses. Thanks, Matthew.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.